Hello, I'm Daniela Elana. You're listening to episode 98 of Historical Paranormal. In episode 98, we'll look at some factors that created a burst of serial killers. For those who've been following recent media, Dahmer has been one of the most watched documentaries on Netflix. And interestingly enough, as you look into American history, there was an explosion between 1970 and 1990 following World War I, World War II, Vietnam, the Great Depression. So we'll get reasons why there was an influx of this, and some historians have attributed it to the sexual revolution, the mass production of pornography, socio-political changes, or the Vietnam War. Are murderers born? Is evil innate? Could there even be a killer gene? Or are serial killers created by their environments, by abuse, trauma, neglect? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere between the two ends of the spectrum, at the midway point between nature and nurture. Eminent researchers currently seem happier explaining the behavior of violent sociopaths by referring to the third option as it stands. The thinking is that lived experiences trigger behavior in those predisposed to it. Basically, serial killers are born with the propensity to kill, but are only activated in essence by a catalyst. Generally, it's a childhood abuse or surprisingly frequently pre-adolescent head trauma. There is something else that some experts believe is capable of triggering serial murder: war. The link between war and serial killing. The Motown singer Edwin Starr pretty much nailed it in the 1970s when he told us how war is good for absolutely nothing. He failed to mention in the song that it may be useful for one thing, though: the creation of a generation of callous killers. The true crime writer Dr. Peter Vronsky explored the link between war and serial murder in his 2018 book, Sons of Cain. In it, he points out that 82% of U.S. serial killers in the 20th century were active between 1970 and 1999. They grew up in the 1940s and 50s, a time where so many American families were decimated by the trauma and loss caused by the Second World War. It is his conclusion that the after effects of war can trip murderous intent in those that may be inclined to it. There's some evidence to suggest that people directly affected by war can be pushed towards violence when they return home too. While it would be unfair to flippantly generalize all post-traumatic stress disorder sufferers as would-be murderers, unsupported war veterans with the condition have been shown to commit violent crimes more often than other members of society. Journalist and writer David Phillips followed a battalion of soldiers returning home from Iraq, many of whom had PTSD, in his 2010 book Lethal Warrior. In it, he claims that the per capita murder rate for the small group was 100 times greater than the national average. War dehumanizes. To make effective killers, armed forces make their charges believe it's okay to take another person's life. Once you instill that into someone, it's very difficult to undo it. It's also not in the interest of any squadron or unit to do so, so they rarely bother. The Vietnam War was one of the most complicated, bloodthirsty, controversial, and deranged conflicts in modern history. It also was one of the least justifiable. American soldiers were programmed to kill an enemy on the other side of the world that posed them, their country, and their family no risk whatsoever. The slaughter of those killed weighed heavy on their consciousness indeed. The list of U.S. soldiers to return from Vietnam only to go on to become serial killers in their homeland is not a short one. The list is by no means comprehensive. Arthur Shawcross, aka the Genesee River Killer; Joseph James DeAngelo, aka the Golden State Killer; Gary Ridgway, aka the Green River Killer; William Bonin, aka the Freeway Killer; Randy Kraft, aka the Scorecard Killer; Leonard Lake; Gary Lewington; Ronald Gene Simmons; Joseph Ernest Atkins; Kenneth Lee Boyd; Carrie Bradford Cohn; James Floyd Davis; Philip Carl Jablonski; James Rodney Johnson; James Allen Kidney; Leonard Marvin Laws; Daryl Mees; Michael Andrew Nicolou; Gary Lee Roll; Morris Solomon Jr., Russell Wayne Wagner; Ward Weaver Jr., Dan White; Marvin Beegler; David Livingston Funches; William Menser; Larry Wayne White; John Dwight Kennedy; David Notek; Jeffrey Don Lungden; Roy Lewis Norris. Every single one of these men above was trained by the U.S. Armed Forces, both physically and psychologically, to kill. Every single one fought in Vietnam. Every single one killed multiple times on their return. While it's true that some of the Vietnam vets may have had a killer instinct and had been tempted by the notion of state-sanctioned license to kill, many told police when apprehended that their crimes were the result of their experience during combat. It's arguable, of course, that this is merely a useful excuse. This point, however, stands. However, that they each took on board some pretty heavy education on the art of murder, learning only how to kill, but not how to care. The Phoenix Program. Orchestrated covertly by the CIA, the Phoenix Program was the USA's attempt to destabilize and destroy the Viet Cong via unscrupulous methods, such as torture and targeted execution. More than 200 more than 25,000 Vietnamese men and women children were captured, tortured, and killed in a bloody and mostly secretive campaign, which has since been described as a civilian assassination program by its ardent critics. Described in jarring detail by Douglas Valentine in the Phoenix program, America's Use of Terror in Vietnam, these kidnaps, torture, session, rapes, assassinations, bombings, or sometimes even village burnings were mostly carried out by South Vietnamese forces, but highly trained U.S. soldiers were often involved too, in either supervisory or more hands-on ways. The mental scarring of young men taken from the farms and cities of America and coerced into carrying out or witnessing truly despicable acts of evil on their fellow man must have been considerable. Arthur Shawcross, who killed 11 sex workers in New York State on his return from Vietnam, is claimed in tape interviews to have worked in the program. It's also widely thought that Richard Ramirez's cousin Mike, who effectively mentored Richard in killing, was also involved. Further concrete details are sketchy, as it is the case with most good CIA operations. Raging for 20 years, finally coming to an end in 1975, the Vietnam War was a bloody mess that saw millions die and the United States politically humiliated. It also irreparably damaged the psyches of many of the men called to fight in it. Did it create a generation of serial killers, though? It's a bold claim. Perhaps the fact that the deadly activity of America's golden generation of serial killers peaked just a few years after the war ended is a coincidence. Then again, perhaps it's not. It's worth bearing in mind that it won't have been those fighting in Asia that were subjected to the war. People back at home were watching the horror unfold on news bulletins, becoming desensitized to extreme violence. Could that not have been enough to trigger any dormant serial killers? For the sake of the future of humanity, let's hope not. It's interesting, all of the ties to that golden era of serial killers. Fortunately, we haven't seen the same boom in recent years with a string of serial killers, and there is a series on YouTube called Program to Kill with multiple parts that goes over some of the most infamous serial killers, and even some of these serial killers' ties to Satanism, such as Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, who was mentioned also in a few episodes back, the Cecil Hotel episode. So stay tuned. Thank you for listening. Until next time.